Part 4. The Heart, Accused or Called. General Audience number 44 of October 15th, 1980. During our many Wednesday meetings, we analyzed in detail the words in the Sermon on the Mount in which Christ addresses the human heart. We now realize that his words are demanding. Christ says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to desire her in a reductive way has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 28. Such a reference to the heart throws light on the dimension of human interiority, the dimension of the inner man proper to ethics, and even more to the theology of the body. The reductive desire that springs up in the sphere of the concupiscence of the flesh is at one and the same time an inner and a theological reality that is in some way experienced by every historical man. It is precisely this man, even if he does not know Christ's words, who continually asks this question about his own heart. Christ's words make this question particularly explicit. Is the heart accused or called to the good? This is the question we will consider now toward the end of our reflections and analyses about the statement in the Gospel from Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 28. Connected with this concise and categorical statement, so pregnant with theological, anthropological, and ethical content. A second question goes hand in hand with it, a more practical question. How can and should someone act who accepts Christ's words in the Sermon on the Mount? Someone who accepts the ethos of the gospel and who accepts it particularly in this area. This person finds in the reflections carried out so far the answer, at least the indirect answer, to the two questions. How can he act? That is, on what can he count his innermost being at the source of his interior and exterior acts? And further, how should he act? That is, how do the values recognized in accord with the scale revealed in the Sermon on the Mount constitute a duty of his will and of his heart, of his desires, and of his choices? In what way do they oblige him in action and behavior? If, once they are accepted through knowledge, they commit him already in thought and in some way in feeling. These questions are significant for human proxies, and they indicate an organic link between proxies itself and ethos. A living morality is always the ethos of human proxies. One can answer these questions in different ways. Both in the past and today, in fact, people have been and are giving various answers. An abundant literature confirms this point. Beyond the answers that we find in this literature, one should take into account the unlimited number of answers given by concrete human beings on their own account. Answers repeatedly given by the conscience, consciousness, and moral sensibility of every human being in his or her life. In this area, there's a continual interpenetration of ethos and proxies. Here, one sees the life, not merely a theoretical life, lived by the individual principles, that is, by the norms of morality with their motives, elaborated and popularized by moralists, but also elaborated, certainly not without connection with the work of moralists and scholars, by individual persons as direct authors and subjects of real morality, as co-authors of their history, on which the level of morality itself, its progress or decadence, depends. In all of this, everywhere and always, historical man reconfirms himself as the one to whom Christ once spoke, announcing the good news of the gospel in the Sermon on the Mount, in which, among others, he spoke the words we read in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to desire her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." The statement in Matthew is stupendously concise in comparison with everything written on this topic in world literature. Its power in the history of ethos perhaps lies in this. At the same time, one must realize that the history of ethos runs in a riverbed with many forms in which individual currents approach each other and flow apart. Historical man always evaluates his own heart in his own way, just as he also judges his own body. And in this way, he passes from the pole of pessimism to the pole of optimism, from puritanical strictness to present-day permissiveness. It is necessary to realize this so that the ethos of the Sermon on the Mount can always be sufficiently transparent when it confronts man's actions and behavior. For this purpose, some further analyses are necessary. Section A. Condemnation of the body. Manichaeism. Our reflections about the meaning of Christ's words, according to Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 and 28, would not be complete if we did not dwell, at least briefly, on what one could call the echo of these words in the history of human thought and of the evaluation of ethos. Echo is always a transformation of the voice and of the words expressed by the voice. We know from experience that such a transformation is often full of mysterious fascination. In the present case, what happened is rather something contrary. In fact, Christ's words were often stripped of their simplicity and depth, and a meaning was given to them that is far from the one they expressed, a meaning that in the end conflicts with them. What we have in mind here is all that happened on the margins of Christianity under the name of Manichaeism, and that attempted to enter the terrain of Christianity precisely in the area of the theology and ethos of the body. In its original form, Manichaeism, which sprang up in the Orient from Mazdean dualism, that is, outside the biblical sphere, saw the source of evil in matter, in the body, and therefore condemned all that is bodily in man. And since in man bodiliness manifests itself above all through one sex, the condemnation was extended to marriage and conjugal life, and to all other spheres of being and acting in which bodiliness expresses itself. To an unaccustomed ear, the evident strictness of that system might seem to harmonize with the strict words of Matthew chapter 5, verse 29 to 30, in which Christ speaks about tearing out your eye and cutting off your hand if these members are the cause of scandal. By a purely material interpretation of these expressions, it is even possible to reach a Manichaean view of Christ's statement about the man who has committed adultery in his heart, by looking at a woman to desire her. In this case as well, the Manichaean interpretation tends to condemn the body as the true source of evil, because in it, according to Manichaeism, the ontological principle of evil both conceals and manifests itself. People thus tried to discover, and at times they saw, such a condemnation in the gospel, finding it where, on the contrary, the only thing expressed is a particular demand addressed to the human spirit. Note that the condemnation might and may always be a loophole to avoid the requirements set in the gospel by him who knew what was in every man. John 2:25. Proofs are not lacking in history. We have already partially had the opportunity, and will certainly have it again, to show to what degree this demand can only spring from an affirmation, and not from a negation or from a condemnation, if it is to lead to a subjectively and objectively even more mature and deep affirmation. And such an affirmation of the human being's femininity and masculinity as a personal dimension of being a body must guide the words of Jesus according to Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28. This is the correct ethical meaning of these words. They impress on the pages of the gospel a particular dimension of ethos in order to impress this dimension also within human life. We will take up this topic again in our next reflections.